As the United Nations marks the 80th anniversary of its founding, it's facing unprecedented challenges. In addition to an ever-growing list of pressing international issues, it's an organisation under enormous internal pressure, with spending cuts and calls for fundamental reform. But what does all this mean in real terms, and can the UN be fixed? To discuss all this, I'm joined by Richard Gowan, the Director for the UN and Multilateral Diplomacy at the International Crisis Group and one of the world's foremost authorities on the UN system. Hello, Richard. Thanks so much for joining us on this. I guess where I'd like to start is by saying, this is obviously the 80th anniversary of the foundation of the UN. It's a time when you'd imagine that there would be celebrations, but one gets a real sense that this is an organization in deep trouble. Perhaps you could just sort of outline, as somebody very close to it and on the ground, I'm talking to you you're in New York at the moment. What's the sentiment within the UN at the moment?
Well, the mood around the UN has gone from bleak to catastrophic in the last few months. And the reason everyone is so panicked at the moment is obviously the Trump administration has come into office and already frozen or cut, a lot of money for the UN's work. But it is worth saying that even before Trump, this was an organization with a creeping sense of existential angst. The Russian aggression against Ukraine, the war between Israel and Hamas, and actually quite a few other conflicts like the war in Sudan have, hit the UN really hard, because the Security Council has been divided over how to respond. UN mediation has failed to have much impact in any of those cases. In the case of Gaza, UN aid workers, can't even get into the Strip much of the time. So diplomats did not expect this to be a particularly happy 80th birthday for the UN under any circumstances. But Trump really has made stuff much, much worse, because the US remains absolutely essential to the UN in financial terms. And we now have Washington saying that it will slash humanitarian budgets, doesn't want to pay for UN peacekeeping. I mean, this is taking us to an even darker place than we were before.
And I mean, just maybe to give a bit of a context on just how bleak this financial situation is.
Well, I think to some extent people have been dodging the fact for many years that the UN has been deeply dependent on the US for funding. And so the US pays, roughly a quarter of the organization's regular budget and peacekeeping budget, but it actually pays an even higher percentage of the money that goes to big international humanitarian organizations like the World Food Programme. Last year, WFP got nearly half of its funding from the US. UNHCR, the refugee agency, got about 40% of its funding from the US. And so when Washington has been saying that it's very rapidly going to cut back that funding, that leaves UN officials really with no idea where to go. And actually, just this weekend, there was a story that the Trump administration was threatening to cut off all money to the World Food Programme globally if it didn't cooperate with US proposals for a new way of getting aid into Gaza that the UN doesn't think is sustainable. This means that already we've seen aid agencies shedding or announcing that they will shed thousands of staff. WFP, again, probably about a quarter of its staff. And the reality is that almost everyone around the UN is now assuming that their budget for 2025 is going to be maybe 75% of what they had hoped for. And taking off that amount of money is pretty desperate, and the humanitarians are facing an even bigger crunch. And this means that, especially in Geneva and Rome, where a lot of the main humanitarian headquarters are, UN officials are just literally working out where they're going to be feeding fewer people, where they're going to be providing less shelter and less health support to the vulnerable. This is a very, very acute moment with pretty immediate repercussions to what the UN can do in trouble spots and crisis zones.
Is there any opportunity for funds to come from other sources? I mean, you say how much the United States pays in. Can any of that be made up, for example, by Europeans, by Japan, South Korea, the other, let's broadly call them Western countries, that would contribute? And the other thing, of course, which comes into this is, if I'm correct, there's a huge problem with getting countries to pay on time anyway. So it's not just the United States. I think it's roughly only a quarter tend to pay, on January the 1st or whatever date they're meant to pay. And the rest it's then chasing up, sometimes many years in arrears.
I mean, on the arrears point, yes. I mean, the Biden administration, tried to be a good financial supporter of the UN, but because of issues with Congress, it was always well behind on its payments. And China, which has become an increasingly important contributor to at least the UN peacekeeping budget, is also often very, very late, I think, to pay now. And there are a lot of other countries that sometimes for political reasons, but sometimes just for bureaucratic reasons, do pay late, which means that, again, even before Trump arrived, the UN Secretariat was having constant cash flow problems. And there's been talk both last year and this year of potentially the Secretariat here in New York just running out of money and not being able to pay salaries. So these US cuts are coming in on top of a already very creaky financial situation. As to who could step up, well, I think sadly, we see a difference to where things were in 2017 and 2018 during Trump's first term. Trump took quite a few whacks at the UN in his first administration, although not on the same scale. But at that time, the Europeans were quite willing to step up and, at least partially cover the gaps that emerged. This time around, from last November onwards, European diplomats have been saying completely straight to their UN counterparts, there is no money. We need every euro we can find to invest in defense. And actually, even since the scale of the Trump cuts became clear, we've seen the UK downsizing its aid budget. We've seen the Netherlands cutting funding. To be quite frank, most Western countries right now are broadly following the direction of travel that Trump is setting in terms of reducing financial support to the UN. Now, people will find little pots of money for especially concerning situations. There was a conference on Sudan recently in London, and I think the UK did scrape together a pledge of cash to Sudan. But there are a lot of other places where the money is just not forthcoming. One big question that everyone has been asking is, well, is this an opportunity for China? Could China step up with extra cash and effectively, buy the UN at a bargain price? I have to say, in my conversations with Chinese officials and with what we're hearing from around the UN, Beijing doesn't want to do that either. I mean, Beijing is facing some financial headwinds of its own. I think it has some questions about, how efficient or valuable parts of the UN are. And so Chinese officials are also saying, don't look to us to save the organization. And as a result, the new mantra in New York is we will have to do less with less. There is a certain fatalism now that the UN is about to go through a very painful period of shrinkage because no one is going to come to its aid at the scale that is necessary.
That would bring us to the next point, which would be there is also a lot of talk of reform at the moment. But there's, frankly, I mean, we both followed the UN for a very long time. There's always been a lot of talk for reform. But, in this 80th anniversary, I mean, the Secretary General recently announced this UN 80 initiative. from what I can gather, there's not a lot of meat on those bones at the moment. So what potentially are some of the things that are being thought about to sort of manage not only the financial crunch, but also a number of deeper structural issues that the UN might have?
Well, there's short-term thinking and then longer-term thinking. In the short term, the UN Secretariat and UN agencies simply have to find savings. So, as I say, there are job cuts on the horizon. There is talk of moving a lot of staff away from expensive UN centers like New York or Geneva, and shifting them to less costly UN centers like Nairobi, which is a big UN headquarters in Africa. And there's a hope that if you move staff around, ultimately that will make everything cheaper. I have to say there are some short-term questions about whether that's true. Relocating staff would come with its own expense. But I think the bigger point is, this is not just a cash flow crisis. This is not just a short-term economic problem. If you're really looking at a long-term reduction of the UN's global footprint, then you have to decide where are you going to prioritize and what are you going to let go. Antonio Guterres was slow to start answering these problems. He had worked quite well with Trump during Trump's first term. I don't think he was very enthusiastic about having to deal with Trump a second time around. I mean, not a completely unfamiliar emotion for many of us. So he didn't really get a grip on this during the transition period. And then back in the spring, he was clearly under pressure from a lot of donors to act. So he set up a very broad reform initiative called UN 80. And under this banner, a group of senior UN officials have been sketching out potentially quite radical proposals for shrinking and reorganizing parts of the system to get long-term efficiencies. And they're talking about merging parts of agencies that have duplicative mandates. I mean, for example, there are 3 different agencies in Rome that deal with food. There are 2 agencies in Geneva that deal with human displacement, UNHCR dealing with refugees, and IOM dealing with migrants. In those cases, there are actually fairly obvious ways that you could merge operational departments, cut costs by improving cooperation. And then similarly in the development space, there are a lot of different UN agencies doing roughly similar things, many of which are also now sort of a bit antiquated in development terms. And so Guterres has been pushing his people to to think about fairly hefty restructuring exercises. That's great on paper. An early options paper from the UN 80 team leaked about 2 weeks ago that outlined some of these changes, implied they were going in a radical direction. But you and I have both watched the UN, and we also know that UN reform always begins with big ideas and then, often delivers remarkably small outcomes. And I think there is quite a lot of concern in New York and Geneva that once both bureaucrats and also self-interested member states start looking at these radical plans, they will start messing around, and what will come out will be less radical and probably less logical than some of the reforms I'm talking about.
Bringing up Guterres was a crucial point in all of this, because he's only got about 18 months or so left in office. So this is sort of tying in, and we're going to get into that sort of period of vying to become successor. And I think 2 questions would come out of this. How would you make the overall assessment of Guterres' period in office? I mean, now that he's getting close to the end of his second term, and perhaps just outline some of the names that have been thought about as a potential successor.
So firstly, on Guterres, when I look back over his time, it reminds me there's a quote attributed to Napoleon that Napoleon said, the most important thing in a general is to be lucky. And I guess that applies to UN Secretaries General too. And it doesn't apply to Guterres, because Guterres has been incredibly unlucky in the global circumstances he's had to work in. So he was selected at the tail end of the Obama administration, and a couple of weeks later, Trump took office. And so Guterres had to spend 4 years dealing with Trump 1.0, which was already pretty tricky. And he had to spend a lot of time trying to find ways to respond to the US, pulling out of the Paris Climate Change Agreement, pulling out of the UN Human Rights Council, so on and so forth. He actually did that pretty well. I think he at that time had a decent personal relationship with Trump, although that now seems to have evaporated. But then when Trump left office in 2021, there was a sort of a feeling like, well, now Guterres can really sort of step up, and he can sort of fix the big international problems that he wasn't able to touch to date. And then lo and behold, you have Ukraine, you have Gaza, and I think Guterres has spent a lot of time really struggling to keep up with events. He has attempted to introduce big new ideas into the UN system. He's a very, very smart guy, and I think he's frustrated that he can't focus more on sort of long-term problems like regulating artificial intelligence. But at the end of the day, he's judged on Gaza, he's judged on Ukraine, and I think that the general view amongst diplomats in New York now is that his time in office has been disappointing, but ultimately for reasons beyond his control. Everyone looks back on Kofi Annan, the sort of Secretary General who was the sort of star of the UN during the post-Cold War period. But the reason that Annan was able to be a star was that, at least for a time, he had pretty permissive geopolitical conditions to work in. And then even he sort of tripped up when the Iraq War split the Security Council. I don't think Annan would have performed as well if he had been in office in the same period that Guterres has been in office. So I think, circumstances define what the UN leader can achieve, which does then raise the question, like, why would any sane person want to be the next Secretary General? But, international politics is full of egos, and lo and behold, there are quite a lot of people who believe they could do the job better. And actually, the last couple of months, we've started to see candidates coming forward, although the selection of the next Secretary General doesn't come around until the autumn of 2026. In the running right now, there's Mia Mottley, the Prime Minister of Barbados, who has been running a shadow campaign for quite a few years. She's very strong on things like climate change and international development. There's a sense that she might have been a shoe-in candidate if you had a Harris presidency, but her themes are not so easy in the Trump era. You have Rafael Grossi, the head of the International Atomic Energy Agency. He's from Argentina. He's suddenly very openly on campaign. I think arguing that, he's shown with things like the diplomacy over Zaporizhia that he can deal with big powers. Michelle Bachelet, former Chilean president, is in the mix. She's been in the mix, I think, for nearly 15 years. Still a name in the game. And then there are some internal candidates from inside the UN too, such as Rebecca Grinspan, who is a UN trade official in Geneva, who was one of the architects of the Black Sea Grain Initiative, so can again claim that she knows how to deal with big power politics. Those are the names right now. Other names pop up. Some I think are serious, some are not. It's a long road to October 2026, which is when we would expect this decision to be made. I think some names will fall out, and I think other people will jump in, and it's going to be a chaotic period because, to be Secretary General, you need the support of all five veto members of the Security Council. And, the US in particular, it's just very, very unpredictable what Washington will be looking for when we finally approach the real selection process.
The UN tends to work on a geographical rotating, and it seems from the names that you were suggesting that there is very much sense that it is back to the Americas. I mean, it's their turn, if you like.
So, yeah, I mean, the tradition is that the top job rotates by region, although actually 10 years ago it was meant to be Eastern Europe's turn, but there was no politician that Moscow and the West could accept. So now, in theory, it's Latin America's turn. And yeah, I mean, so I've been talking about candidates from that region. However, there's no guarantee, I think, in this sort of environment that ultimately a Latin American will succeed. Guterres, a Western European, was able to slide in when it was supposedly Eastern Europe's slot. There definitely are non-Latin American names in the mix. I mean, Amina Mohammed, who is the current Deputy Secretary General, I think Nigerian. She's known to have an eye on the top job. I've heard of a few candidates from Eastern Europe who think that maybe it is their time now. People like Vuk Jeremic, who's a former foreign minister of Serbia, who I think hopes he can somehow bridge Trump land and Moscow. And I've heard whispers of candidates from further afield. So yeah, nothing is certain, I think, and it's also quite possible that it won't be easy to find a candidate at all. So we might be sitting here in December of next year, with the clock counting down on Guterres' last month, and we still might not be certain who is going to step up and replace him.
I have one final question, which is something that I think I often encounter whenever I talk about issues where the UN has even a rather tangential involvement. There's a lot of skepticism out there about the value of the UN. A lot of people seem to believe that the UN should disappear. It's useless. It's biased. It's wasteful. How would you respond to sort of people who bring up those sort of criticisms? And I'm sure you hear it the whole time yourself.
Yes, and I think it's worth saying that versions of that skepticism, are present in the UN system too. It's not unusual to meet quite senior diplomats in Turtle Bay, which is where the UN headquarters is, who say that we think this institution has value, but it's jolly hard for us to persuade our capitals that it's really meaningful to them. And I think we're a very, very long way from the early 1990s, or even the first decade of this century, which is when I started working around the UN, when it was obvious that the institution was flawed, where it was obvious that things like the Security Council were already a bit anachronistic. But nonetheless, UN peacekeeping was really working in large parts of Africa. UN diplomacy and UN mediation was still an important component of global affairs. I mean, things have not gone in the right direction since then. I mean, UN peacekeeping is still quite important in places like South Sudan, but it's definitely shrunk. And this is a process you followed too. UN mediators really just can't get a foothold in conflicts like the Sudanese civil war or the Burmese civil war. Looking beyond peace and security, the world is not keeping pace with the UN Sustainable Development Goals. It's not keeping pace with the Paris pledges on climate change and global warming from 10 years ago. So there are good reasons to be gloomy. What I would say, though, is if you step back and you look at what the UN system as a whole does, it still provides a pretty crucial safety net for a lot of people in a lot of very, very fragile places. And, I think an obvious case that a lot of people try to forget is Afghanistan. The West was in Afghanistan for 2 decades. It ran away. Who was left behind to get life-saving aid and food and medicine to the Afghans? UN agencies. And UN agencies have stayed on in Afghanistan since the fall of Kabul. They've had a terrible time working with the Taliban, especially over gender issues. But if the UN wasn't in Afghanistan, you would have probably had a series of waves of famine. And you would have had a sort of complete state collapse in Afghanistan with pretty bad regional implications. And that is, that's an example that still resonates, I think, a little bit in the West, but there are also a lot of other situations, the Horn of Africa, the Sahel, where, UN humanitarian aid, UN life-saving work is really, all that stands between complete immiseration and chaos. I mean, what worries me now is that actually what the Trump administration's aid cuts are doing is precisely targeting the bits of the UN that have been continuing to provide those safety net functions. So we may find out quite quickly what it's like when you don't have the UN in those places, or at least in the places when simply no one else will come to provide help. And I think what we'll see is quite possibly a return to the sort of levels of famine, sort of levels of disease spread, that with the focus of in the 1970s and 1980s, the sort of level of suffering that gave us Live Aid, and that will be morally shocking, and I think it will also be destabilizing. So, that is actually what I worry most about losing the UN. But I think what we're going to see is the UN going through an incredibly complex period of change, and there may be some surprise outcomes. This may be an organization where suddenly middle powers from the global south, like Brazil and Indonesia, just gain a huge amount more influence because Western countries are tiptoeing away. So the future is really unwritten at the moment, but the present is quite dark.
Richard, look, I want to say a huge thank you for agreeing to talk about all of this. I mean, it's been incredibly helpful. I'd love to say it's been incredibly hopeful, but of course it isn't. And I think you really are the world authority on the UN system. So thank you very, very much for talking to us about it. I hope you found that useful. If so, here are some more videos that you might find interesting. Thanks so much for watching, and see you in the next video.